Good afternoon and welcome to our workshop. My name is Andrea Gonzalez and I am part of the CABES team. Today, I, along with my colleague, will be supporting with any questions and moderating the chat throughout our session. I am excited now to introduce our presenter, Laurie Olsen, for this workshop. Thank you and have a wonderful session.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. Welcome to the workshop, Learning from Our History, a Legacy of Courage and Activism, Stories from the Movement for Educational Access and Equity for English Learners in California, which is also the name of the book from which the stories I'm going to share have been taken. I'm really glad you're here. I'm also curious about why you came, because here it is dinner time on a work day, and who has time to deal with history? All of us are neck deep in the daily work of keeping our bilingual programs going and of dealing with the ravages of the pandemic. But actually, I think this is exactly the time we need our history. Throughout the whole history of public schools in this nation, we've needed movements for educational access to fight to establish basic rights to equal educational opportunity, to push against the forces of exclusion that seek to deny education to the children of racial, linguistic, and cultural minority groups. And California has been a central stage. It's been a ground zero for many of these struggles, particularly with regard to immigrant children. And there's some enduring scars from that history and very important lessons that I think can serve both to inspire us now and as very practical solutions for exactly the challenges we're facing today. So I'm glad you're here with us. I'm going to start the session with just a quick broad brush of very early history as a backdrop, history before our lifetimes, and then we'll focus in on stories from the past 50 years and from our own lifetimes. We were once a land where there were thousands of Native American languages spoken, and then French and German and Russian and Portuguese and English were added as Europeans came to settle the colonies. And so by the time the framers of the new United States Constitution sat down to do their work, they decided there would be no official language in the new nation because that would privilege one language group over another. And that tradition is held for hundreds of years. There never has been an official language, and there still isn't for the United States. And yet the battles over language as a marker of who's included, who's excluded, and the ways in which the politics of language have been deeply entwined in our battles over immigration and conquest and citizenship and enslavement and empire building is a very profound and deep vein in United States history. Schools and education and dual language education, bilingual education, immigrant education have always been right at the crosshairs of those battles. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War. The US paid $15 million to Mexico, giving the US ownership of a huge territory that now comprises California, roughly half of New Mexico, most of Arizona, Nevada, Utah, and Colorado. And Mexicans in those areas had a choice. They could retreat within the new borders of Mexico or be incorporated into the United States. And as many have said, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And to this day, the issue of Spanish, the place of Spanish and the schooling of children throughout the West and Southwest is hotly contested. Large numbers of Chinese people were brought to California to build the Transcontinental Railroad, and even more immigrated attracted by gold rush fever. And a whole series of anti-Chinese exclusion and discriminatory laws greeted them, including prohibiting Chinese American children from enrolling in schools in California. And in 1855, the very first California law was passed requiring instruction in schools had to be in English. So schools became a mechanism of exclusion. And there was also the era in which the US finally and formally ended Andrew Jackson's brutal Indian removal policy and began instead to pursue what they called assimilation, largely through the forced education of Indian children in boarding schools off the reservations, where they were punished for using their own language for any behavior that displayed their indigenous culture. The curriculum was explicitly designed to, quote, eradicate Indian culture and language. So schools became a means of erasing culture and language. And meanwhile, German immigrants throughout the Midwest had established German-speaking institutions like their own churches, their schools. But in the buildup to the First World War, anti-German sentiment created an unprecedented wave of language restriction. Laws actually banned German words. Teachers in German schools were jailed. Schools were shut down. And the concept that speaking English was a marker of patriotism and a marker of being American really took hold and became formalized in widespread policies to ensure that instruction in US schools would be in English. So the schools became enlisted in defining who was American. And by the 20th century, California schools then were formally English taught institutions and racially and linguistically segregated, with less financed, less resourced, separate schooling for African-American children, for Chinese descent children, for Spanish-speaking Mexican-American children. And always people have fought back. And the movements and the battles to end unequal and segregating schooling set out to try to establish a legal end to discrimination and a legal right to equal educational opportunity. So it was in 1931 in Lemon Grove, California, that Mexican-American parents refused their children being relocated to an inferior Mexican school. And they battled against the local school board to win an end to segregation, which was the first successful desegregation case in the state. And then 2 decades later, parents of 5,000 Mexican-American children in Orange County filed in federal court, saying their children were victims of unconstitutional discrimination by being forced to attend those separate schools. And the courts ruled in their favor, and thus the case we all know about, Mendez versus Westminster, legally struck down segregation, racial segregation in the state of California. And the legal arguments from that case became the foundation for the famous Brown v. Board of Ed Supreme Court decision that ended racial segregation in schools for the nation a decade later. So race, ethnicity, skin color, language, and national background were all deeply entangled and all rolled together in the dynamics of the public schooling system, of educational exclusion, of segregation, and language policy. But I'm going to pause now because I'm getting to the span of time, which really are our lifetime, where we have stories from people still alive to tell about them, by people who lived those battles, who, like some of you I know out there, were part of shaping what happened in California schools as the movement for bilingual education took shape. There were 4 distinct eras that we have, that I want to cover. The first is the civil rights era, in the 70s and 80s, of building our bilingual education field and establishing bilingual policy and crafting program models and really becoming a national leader in bilingual education. Followed by an era of backlash and pushback in which most of our gains were contested and eventually largely destroyed. Then there was the hard time, the 1990s, turn of the century, of entrenched and enforced English-only policies and accountability and programs. And then finally, our current era, the dawn of a new time, which has given rise to wonderful new promising policies and a new embracing of multilingualism. So it's been a roller coaster, a fascinating, complex, whiplashing roller coaster. And I'm going to share stories with you from that. But first, I need to just ask you this. Do you ever wonder how it is that policies related to bilingual education and English learners actually change? Like, for example, how is it that California, which was once the national leader in the hotbed for bilingual education, became the center of the English-only movement? And then how was it that it took 20 years to beat that back? So once again, we're a national leader in multilingual policy. Or do you ever wish people knew all the daily work and the constant effort that goes into advocating for bilingual programs and for your English learner students, changing people's attitudes and belief systems, getting schools to change their practices? Have you ever felt so very tired as an advocate, wishing there were others who had your experience and your dedication, who could pick up the torch of being a voice for English learners and give you a break or be an ally or walk with you? I want to see, I'm just curious in the chat, does anybody say yes to any of these? Because if you, yes, Amber, Maritza, because if you answered yes, you can understand why I became involved in collecting the stories and the content for the book that I'm going to be sharing with you today. I always loved history. In fact, I was a high school history teacher, fascinated with how things became how they are. But I don't think I ever really thought of myself as someone who might be part of making history, somebody with some pieces of the history that deserved to be told, until I was part of our remarkable movement for bilingual education and educational justice for English learners here in California. And having lived through it, having participated in that history, having witnessed it, still being part of it, I felt compelled to tell it. And I wasn't alone. There was a group of well, we'll just call us aging advocates, who'd been part of the struggles for bilingual ed in California for many decades, who came together to put our energies into supporting a younger generation of advocates. So around the table, there were representatives from CABE, from Californians Together. There were lawyers who had argued the key landmark bilingual education court cases, and educators who'd piloted our powerful new bilingual models, researchers who'd worked to create the research base that really supports bilingual education, lobbyists and staff who'd worked in Sacramento on legislation. All of us trying to figure out what could we do that would support next generations of advocates, and how could we codify some of what we'd learned from our decades of working in the movement. And that group came together to form the English Learner Legacy and Leadership Initiative, fondly called ELLI. And even in the title of ELLI is the word legacy, was that firm conviction that our history mattered. We knew that there was unwritten stories about the movement that might be helpful to people now, that could illuminate lessons learned, advocacy strategies that had worked in the past, things that hadn't worked, mistakes that were made. Because when history isn't written, when it isn't told, when it isn't known, each generation is left on their own. So for ELLI, I took on the task of collecting and documenting and writing some of that history. And we were looking for specific advocacy moments that was important for people to know about, or specific advocacy strategies that would be helpful for people to really study and learn about. So the chapters, the stories were selected based on what we thought would be useful. They were collected through oral histories and interviews with people who'd been part of those battles, part of those struggles, part of that important work. And then it was supported with archival research to fill in the blanks and the context. So those stories, used first as part of the ELLI curriculum, became a book, which is dedicated, as I read here, with deep gratitude for courage and inspiration to the hundreds of advocates and activists whose stories are told in this volume, and whose voices and actions have fueled the movement to create schools that open doors and honor the intellect and dreams of English learner students, families, and communities. I know that many of you here, I haven't been able to read through the whole list of participants, but were and are part of this history. So as I tell some of these stories, I really want you to write into the chat for each other to see. I was there, or I remember XYZ, or I was part of this, or I felt the impact of, or perhaps I never knew that, but hearing it now helps me make sense of this thing that I'm seeing and feeling and experiencing now. Yes, Miriam, Promise Initiative, one of those stories for sure. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to where I left off in our timeline in the 1960s with the federal civil rights law that formally ended discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and national origin, and ushering in what I have dubbed the era of building programs and building a field, the 1970s, 80s, and early 1990s. And here's one story. Did you know that a Chicano youth movement in San Diego in the 1970s emerged, energized by the civil rights movement, and used student walkouts to press their demands, access to college preparation courses, an end to equating accents and use of Spanish with being of lesser intelligence. They wanted bilingual education and curriculum that incorporated the histories and contributions of their communities, and they called for teachers and counselors who believed in them and respect for their language and culture. And at that time, despite a significant presence in San Diego of Latinos, there was no representation from that community in politics. Pete Chacon, that's the guy on the right there. Pete Chacon used his GI benefits to earn a college degree and become a teacher in Vista, not too far from San Diego, where he was struck by the injustices of Spanish-speaking children being segregated from other students and put into classes for the mentally retarded. He was convinced that changes in the system and in policy were needed. So he took a leave from his school position to run for state assembly, representing the 70th district, the heart of the Latino community then in San Diego, and explicitly committed to changing the school system. To finance his campaign, he cashed in his teacher's retirement, and he and his wife sold their home. And it was a campaign that galvanized and was fueled by the Chicano students and community volunteers from that Latino movement. For that community, it was an awakening. It was Pete's campaign in which many of them cut their teeth as activists, going door to door, canvassing, polling, working with the media. and Chacon won the state assembly seat in a very surprise upset. It was a seminal win for the community, and those young, passionate activists were instrumental in electing a Chicano activist to the state legislature at first, where Chacon authored the very first bill in California that funded services for English learners and allowing funds for bilingual programs. And later, it was Chacon who authored the strongest bilingual education legislation in the nation. So one lesson for us all in this is we need our communities represented in the legislature. We need bilingual educators in the political realm. And the lesson that we've seen over and over again is that relationships forged in the heat of advocacy campaigns last a lifetime, as it has for that group of young activists from San Diego, who still to this day, a half century later, are active in the movement together. And did you know that after the passage of Chacon's bilingual bicultural education bill, the race was on to figure out what bilingual education really meant, what it looked like, how you do it. And luckily, there was a powerful advocate, Guillermo Lopez, leading the bilingual education office at CDE, who located and called together top bilingual theorists and researchers in the field and charged them with articulating what was known about bilingual development, what was known about dual language, what was known about second language acquisition, so questions could be answered for participants. And Angie's dad was part of it. Go, Angie. Together, that group created the theoretical framework for schooling language minority students, an astonishing collection of ideas that still are the bedrock of the bilingual field. Things like common underlying language proficiency, and that dual language transfer works, and comprehensible input, and that language is culture and culture is language, and they're inextricably connected. And then partnering with advocates in county offices of education and districts, they traversed the state, sharing their theories, supporting educators and experimenting and piloting what those theories might look like in practice, and going after and leveraging Title VII federal grants for demonstration projects and professional development. It was an exciting, bold, important chapter in the history of bilingual education, driven by advocates within the system, acting boldly, sometimes acting beyond the limits of what their jobs were supposed to be, but understanding the importance of linking research and practice, of bringing together theorists and practitioners in the name of building the strongest possible programs that we can. So were you there? I'm anxious to take a minute to look in the chat to see who was part of those Title VII days and the work around the theoretical framework and the building of somebody earned their B-clad from UCR. Yeah, Renee Bryant. All right. Cheryl Ortega was part of it. It was an amazing time. It was a true investment in the field. But that robust time of field building didn't last. By the 1990s, a perfect storm was brewing, and an era of pushback, backlash, and English only began. As major new immigration to California changed the demographics of our communities so they were more multilingual, more multicultural, more multiracial, that overlaid with a really brutal economic recession led to scapegoating of immigrants, and a vociferous English-only movement began to push back. The first ballot initiatives tried to establish English as the official language of California. It was passed by the voters, but our advocacy lawyers fought back, and it was struck down as unconstitutional. And then there was a ballot proposition against using public resources for undocumented people. And that again was fought in the courts and struck down. And then finally, 1998, Proposition 227 went right to the heart of bilingual education. And during that time, in the lead up to Prop 227, there were multiple forces that were eroding bilingual movement, including some policy compromises that the movement for bilingual education had to make. Do you remember Pete Chacon and his bill? Did you know that his Comprehensive Bilingual Bicultural Education Act mandated bilingual education wherever there were 20 or more students at a grade level of the same language? And he required appropriately trained bilingual teachers. Well, in the excitement and the urgency of the moment of shaping that policy, the bill hadn't allowed a phase-in time. There was no adequate timeline for institutes of higher ed to gear up to train bilingual teachers. There was no sufficient investment in teacher training or building a pipeline of bilingual teachers. And that, on top of the English-only movement, was a recipe for fueling a backlash against implementing bilingual programs. Resulted in wave after wave of pressure and bill after bill in the legislature that were watering down those teacher qualifications and creating waivers so districts didn't actually have to hire bilingual teachers to staff those classrooms. The implementation of effective bilingual programs was hugely hindered by the resentment and resistance of teachers against having to get additional training, by the waiver provisions for districts so they didn't really have to hire bilingual teachers for those programs, and weakened the standards for what bilingual teachers should be. In telling her part of the story, one of the people that we interviewed was Shelley Spiegel Coleman, who reflected on how advocates had to really compromise around supporting some of those waiver provisions. And she said, you know, it just wasn't a good model without a strong approach to staffing the classrooms. We ended up with a lot of weak classrooms because we relied on placing bilingual aides into classrooms with teachers that had no bilingual training. We had teachers who didn't want an aide, teachers without the language skills, aides who were not supported or prepared to teach. Teachers didn't want to go to training. They resented being expected to do it. And we ended up with too many weak programs. And that was part of what did bilingual education in at the time. Now, you can read a lot about this incredible history in one of the chapters in the book called Where Are the Teachers? Because it really explains and illuminates the mess we're in now as we still grapple with a major shortage of bilingual teachers, which is one of the main obstacles, of course, to expanding dual language programs. And I want to do a little shout out to Claudia Lockwood, who I believe is in the Zoom room here, who is a major force in these efforts throughout this era. But that English-only era didn't just impact K-12. Did you know, one more story coming, folks, that the English-only movement played a major role in why it was that federal and state policy promoting the importance of preschool education ended up defining school readiness, partially in terms of knowing enough English, which was one of the death knells to what had been a growing dual language bilingual movement in early childhood education. Linguist Lily Wong Fillmore had sought and was unable to get funding to do some documentation and research on the impacts of English-only schooling on young children and the impacts on their families. So she stood up at a NABE conference and she enlisted anybody at that conference who was willing to help carry out what she called the NABE no-cost study, to go back to their communities and, using interview guides and protocols she made available in multiple languages, to document language loss among young children in immigrant families who were in English-only preschools. That all-volunteer research effort produced the first research on language loss and served as the first wake-up call to the damage of English-only early education. As Lily recalled, the results were so consistent and widespread and dramatic and painted such a powerful and painful picture of language loss and the impact on families. We knew we had to share the findings widely. What was at stake was a family's ability to remain close to and connected to their children. So the lessons drawn even from that one example of the NABE no-cost study is about the importance of speaking our truth, documenting what we see happening, and making visible the very real impacts of our educational system on English learner children and families. Now, like the story of the NABE no-cost study, the stories of how advocates persevered during those harsh days of the English-only era in California are full of creativity, determination, and the persistence of advocates throughout the state. So I want to pause and I want to see in that chat, I'm going to catch up a little bit, but how did you persevere? What are some of the stories you have about that English-only era, and stories of either creativity or of the doom about what it was like? Woodland, 1999, fighting to allow bilingual students to be grandfathered in when their numbers dropped below. Yeah, the devastation of that time, the frustration of that time. Renee went from being a transitional bilingual teacher to a sheltered English immersion teacher. Nobody quite knew what that meant at the time, right? We just knew it had to be in English. Many people struggling in school because of it. Yeah. So I want to move us to the next era. and talk a little bit about a story about how we did that, how we moved from an era of really harsh English only times into this time of dual language and multilingualism. And this is the story. Did you know, and I think more of you do know this story now, is that it took 10 years, 10 long years, a decade for the campaign to work the state seal of biliteracy from its very first trials in some brave districts during that English only No Child Left Behind era, through to the initial introduction of legislation, finally getting it passed through the legislature and facing a governor veto. And then going back through again through another round through the legislature. We went through 2 full rounds of legislative sessions, 2 governor's vetoes, 10 years of Martha Zaragoza Diaz's, who was CABE's lobbyist, our wonderful lobbyist, working the bill through the legislator before it finally became state law, and California became the first state in the nation to recognize and honor proficiency in 2 or more languages on the diplomas of graduating seniors. A 10-year campaign, until it was finally signed into law in 2012, has now spread to 42 states across the nation, and a bill to establish a national seal of biliteracy has been introduced in Washington this session. It's the story about how an idea that started small during a very difficult, devastating time after the passage of Prop 227 just refused to stop, gathering supporters and allies district by district by district by district until there was sufficient political pressure to make it a reality. So many stories like these, actions like these, people like these, Pete Chacon, Guillermo Lopez, Lily Wong Fillmore, Shelley Spiegel Coleman, Martha Zaragoza Diaz, hundreds more have led us to where we are now, having amassed the research that so solidly serves as the rationale for bilingual dual language programs, led to the passage of the EDGE initiative, in which voters spoke out about wanting more opportunities for students to become bilingual, and then to the passage of our visionary aspirational English learner roadmap, which superseded Prop 227 and set dual language as one of the missions for the schools of the state. So now here we are in this era of really supportive policy, and yet we know we don't yet have in place the schooling system that honors and embraces our English learners, that has the capacity to deliver on the powerful dual language models that we have, that supports pathways to biliteracy. And hopefully, some of the lessons derived from advocacy in the past can be helpful as we continue the work to bring about such a system. So today I shared just 5 snapshot bits of stories. There are many more with far more depth, analysis, lessons in the book. So I refer you to the book and want to tell you a little bit about the book, and then go back to having us grapple a little bit with what the lessons are. The first section of the book, and I think there's a flyer for the book, the story of Ellie, tells the story of our English Learner Leadership and Legacy Initiative, about what went into the thinking behind it, about the work with Ellie Fellows, that first cohort of Ellie Fellows, the relationships, the transformation that occurred. And it describes also how we articulated and codified what we thought it was that advocates needed to know and be able to do to be really successful and effective. And so one of the gifts to you from this, from Ellie and from this workshop is in fact the Ellie objectives as a handout. We're not going to work with them today, but I really want you to have them to see, oh, these are some of the things to really pay attention to learning, to strengthening my skills to do. The second chapter in the movement building section of the book includes the full story of that remarkable movement in San Diego that I mentioned earlier, that goes all the way from the early days of that Chicano youth movement through the establishment of enduring institutions like PK. It talks about the Battle of Chicano Park and describes the building of San Diego County Office of Ed into being the national leader it is in Spanish language arts and bilingual education. It covers the creation of San Diego State University into really the hotbed, the leader around liberation pedagogy and dual language teacher education and more. And that chapter is dedicated to Rosalia Salinas and Alberto Ochoa. Section 2 of the book has 2 chapters, and I've given you little bits of stories from each of them. The first one is about the teacher shortage, a half century of effort to really address it in California. And it also includes the chapter on dual language learners in early childhood education. And the third section focuses on two specific advocacy campaigns. One of them being the State Seal of Biliteracy, I gave you a little hint about, and the other being about reparable harm and the advocacy campaign to build responsiveness to California's long-term English learners. The fourth section is where you can read about many different ways of being advocates, many different roles of advocacy, from testifying to research, to making presentations, to lobbying, and about the various institutional positioning that we do advocacy from and how that makes a difference. And so there's a chapter there on lobbying. There's a chapter there on nonprofit organizations and advocacy groups, a chapter on advocacy from within county offices of ed, advocacy from within the Department of Education. Remarkably, though, there is no chapter that explicitly focuses on what was probably one of the most defining moments of California's movement for English learner and bilingual education. And that was the rise of the English-only movement and the battle over Prop 227. The long-term devastating impacts of that anti-bilingual policy, the way in which the English-only mentality found its ways into enduring beliefs and attitudes and practices throughout our state, the scars of the ugly Proposition 227 campaign touched every effort since that time to try to create a schooling system responsive to English learners and supportive of dual language. And so every chapter in the book tells a part of that story, describes in its own way how advocates survived the hard time, kept working toward a vision of schooling that embraces the multiple languages and cultures of students, and battled back from that era. So it's by looking across those chapters that you really get the true meaning of what that policy meant for our state. To help integrate those stories, we created a timeline. It goes all the way from 1848, remember, which was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, up through 2020, listed events chronologically, but it weaves together the stories in the book, and it gives you some reference, some way to kind of place yourselves, to situate yourself, and to learn. And so think about, when you look at it, where was it I entered all of this? Whether it's as a student or as a teacher or into the educational system, where on the timeline do I have stories to tell that really illuminate this movement? You do have a handout, and I believe it is listed in the chat. Yes, it is. I also want to refer you to another video resource that's available through Californians Together's website, which is on the history of bilingual English learner education, where I visually create this history. It's in 4 parts, or you can watch the whole thing as an hour. But if you're tired of reading or don't have time to read or want to use a video, this is a good reference as well. But across all of the stories, we asked everybody as we worked to document the stories, what are really the lessons? What are the messages that we have for people in the future? And there's a set of them that I've summarized here and on a handout for you. Remain focused on your core values, just absolutely fixed on your North Star as what guides your actions and guides what you do. Be a critical friend and a persistent voice and an echo to other advocates. Build relationships, create networks, build organizations. We need our organizations, we need our networks, we need our connections to each other. Prepare for the long haul. Right now, it would be easy to feel good because we have such wonderful new policy, but this is a long movement with a long way to go. So prepare for the long haul. When you build a coalition as familia, you build a movement. So it's about what we're doing in the course of building those relationships and how we treat each other as we're working together as advocates. Cross-generational relationships are powerful and sustaining. Both individual advocacy and collective action are needed. We all have to learn to understand the system, how it works, all of its parts, how it is that change happens within the institutions. We need to leverage the inside-outside dynamic. Those advocates working in advocacy organizations and nonprofit organizations and parent groups outside of the schools, working with the advocates inside is a very powerful and essential piece. We need to be reflective in our practice. Think about what we're doing, learn from what we're doing, and take care of ourselves for the long haul, and keep learning, growing, and keeping on. I'm going to give you a little bit of time now to actually skim the lessons learned. And think about, is there some particular lesson from these lessons learned that resonate now for me personally, given what I'm facing, given what I'm working in? And write in the chat what lesson particularly touches you and why it feels important right now. And I'm actually going to stop talking for a few minutes and just enjoy what you write and give you a chance to think. Yeah, your North Star, keeping us focused, Fabiola. Always, what's in our hearts, what we know is most important. Yeah, being a persistent voice. Keep speaking, keep it coming. Yes. I hope, I just saw the time, so I'm gonna keep reading and speaking at the same time. Relationships, understanding the system. I hope these little bits of stories that I've shared with you today are useful to you, because as the introduction to the book reads, we need an army of advocates steeped in the history that brought us to this point, inspired by the victories and successes of the advocacy movement of the past, equipped to understand the complex dynamics and scars in the present that stem from that history, and bolstered and supported in the knowledge of the movement's resilience and survival through hard times. And finally, the stories I shared with you, and even the book, just scratches the surface of the very rich history of the movement for language rights and educational access in bilingual ed. It all should be documented, told, shared, and learned from. The history of the movement is far bigger than these stories, and it would take many more voices, many more chapters, certainly some different authors as well, to tell it. And much of it is still unwritten. I hope that this has inspired you to share your stories of what you've witnessed, what you've wrought, what you've brought about, what you've done to really write the fuller story of what you have of our movement. Because also new stories are unfolding every day in the work we're doing as we chart together the course of the next chapter in our movement. I want to tell you about the book and then have a moment or two for some questions. The book, A Legacy of Courage and Activism, published by Californians Together as a product of the Ellie Initiative, is now available. You can get it on the Californians Together website. You can go to our booth in the Cabe exhibit hall. I'm going to be doing a book signing tomorrow from 2 to 3, but you can also just get it from the website or from the exhibit hall at any time. And we have 3 minutes left. I hate that it goes so quickly. I look forward to going back and reading everything that's in the chat, but we do have time for a question or two if somebody wants to post them in the chat.
Laurie, this is Alicia, and I just have to say out loud that I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that we were supposed to provide you with a formal introduction before we leaped into the presentation. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of all of us. Your critical contributions over the past 5 decades to English learner, immigrant, and bilingual education have been groundbreaking for us, and they've helped us further the work. So thank you so much for your leadership in regarding, directing research, policy, and practice initiatives. Much appreciation.
Oh, thanks, Alicia. And thank you everybody for being here on a work evening at this amazing Cabe conference. And look forward maybe to seeing you at the Cabe booth tomorrow from 2 to 3. Sylvia, yes, go to my email.
Hi, Laurie.
Hi, there's a question, Alicia, about filling out an evaluation form. Do you have an answer for that?
Ooh, let me see if we can find that. I think that someone's going to be dropping that in the chat box. It looked like it may have just come through. Thank you, Monica.
Great. Oh, I see so many people I love and I value from this movement and friends.
Julie, CDE is California Department of Education and NABE is a National Association for Bilingual Education. Great question. I know that was a popular one in the chat this afternoon.
Yeah. Okay. And no other questions, just wonderful comments. So thank you very much all and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Great
Thank
session.
you.
Thank you, Laurie.
Bye.